Camp Clinton, Mississippi. September 12, 1944. The recreation hall at the prisoner of war camp was packed with 300 German soldiers. They sat on wooden benches, smoking American cigarettes provided by the Red Cross, waiting for the weekly film screening. Most expected another tedious propaganda piece, American films designed to convince them they'd lost the war. Obergefreiter Ernst Hoffmann turned to his comrade and grinned. I wonder what lies they'll show us tonight. Last week it was American factories supposedly producing thousands of tanks. Obviously fake. They filmed the same tank 50 times from different angles. Unteroffizier Klaus Brenner laughed. Or the film about American cities with no bomb damage. Clearly studio sets. The Luftwaffe has been pounding their cities for years. They just don't want to admit it. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred to life. On the screen appeared, U.S. War Department official film, The Invasion of France, June 6, 1944. A wave of derisive laughter swept the room. Here we go, Hoffmann muttered. Hollywood's version of the invasion. The film opened with aerial shots of ships, hundreds of them, stretching across what the narrator claimed was the English Channel. The German prisoners immediately began mocking. Look at that, one shouted. They want us to believe they assembled 1,000 ships. Where would they even get them? Special effects, another called out. The same ship filmed many times. American movie tricks. The laughter grew louder as the film showed the bombardment of Normandy beaches. Massive naval guns firing. Explosions along the coast. Landing craft approaching through the surf. Pure Hollywood. Brenner announced to those around him. No fleet that size has ever existed. They think we're idiots. Then the camera cut to a wide shot of Omaha Beach from an elevated position. The frame filled with landing craft. Dozens, scores, hundreds, stretching from the foreground to the distant horizon. Behind them, the sea was gray with ships. Destroyers. Cruisers. Battleships. Transport vessels. A wall of steel that extended as far as the camera could see. In the front row, Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schwartz, who had served in the 352nd Infantry Division defending Normandy, suddenly sat upright. He recognized the pillbox in the left corner of the frame. He'd eaten breakfast in that bunker on June 5th. He recognized the church steeple in the ruined village. He recognized the contours of the bluff. This wasn't a movie set. This was Omaha Beach. WN-62. His sector. And the impossible fleet filling the screen. The fleet his comrades were still laughing at was real. Quiet! Schwartz shouted in German. Quiet! The laughter died. 300 faces turned toward him. Schwartz stood, his hand trembling as he pointed at the screen. That's real, he said, his voice hollow. I was there. That pillbox, I served there. That beach, I defended it. Those ships. His voice broke. Those ships are real. All of them. The recreation hall fell into absolute silence. On screen, the camera panned slowly across the beachhead. The impossible became undeniable. Thousands of vehicles already ashore. Mountains of supplies stacked on the sand. And everywhere, endlessly, the ships. More ships than most of these men had seen in their entire lives, all in one place, all serving one purpose. Someone in the back whispered, Mein Gott! This is the story of the moment German prisoners of war stopped believing their own propaganda. The moment they confronted the physical evidence of why they'd lost. The moment the scales fell from their eyes and they really saw, the industrial colossus they'd been fighting. This is the story of how a newsreel destroyed 1,000 lies. The re-education program. The United States faced a unique challenge with German POWs. Most still believed in Nazi ideology, still believed Germany would win, still believed Allied reports of defeats were propaganda. In 1943, the U.S. War Department established the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, tasked with intellectual diversion, a euphemism for re-education. The goal was to denazify German prisoners and prepare them to return to a democratic Germany after the war. The program included newspapers in German, carefully curated to include truthful reporting, educational classes on democracy and American history work programs to demonstrate American productivity and, crucially, films. The film program was supervised by the Army's Information and Education Division. Every POW camp with suitable facilities showed films weekly or bi-weekly. The selection was carefully managed. Entertainment films, American movies, usually westerns or comedies, to show American culture. Educational films, documentaries about American democracy, industry, agriculture. War documentary films, official War Department footage of battles, invasions, and Allied progress. This last category was the most controversial and the most important. The problem was credibility. German prisoners had been marinated in Nazi propaganda for years. They'd been told the Allies were weak and cowardly. American industry was collapsing. Allied victories were exaggerated or fabricated. Germany still had secret weapons that would turn the tide. The homeland was winning on all fronts. Any film that contradicted this narrative was dismissed as propaganda. Colonel Edward Davison, who oversaw the film program, later wrote, "We faced a paradox. The prisoners needed to see the truth to break through their conditioning. But they'd been conditioned not to believe anything we showed them. Every fact we presented was filtered through their assumption that we were lying. The solution was to overwhelm them with evidence. To show them footage so detailed, so extensive, so specific that denial became impossible. The D-Day films were perfect for this purpose. The footage. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was the most extensively filmed military operation in history up to that point. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, the Navy's Photography Division, and civilian cameramen embedded with units documented everything. The assembly of the invasion fleet in British ports. The channel crossing from multiple ships. The naval bombardment. The beach landings from landing craft and from defensive positions. The aftermath and buildup. Combat cameramen, many of whom died in the operation, captured footage that was raw, immediate, and undeniably authentic. Cameras in waterproof housings filmed from landing craft approaching the beaches. Cameras mounted on ships recorded the naval bombardment. Aerial cameras showed the vast scope of the operation. By late June 1944, Army film editors had compiled hours of D-Day footage into various documentary formats. Short newsreels for domestic theaters. Longer documentary films for military and government audiences. Educational films for training purposes, and propaganda films for POW re-education. The film shown at Camp Clinton that September night was a 40-minute compilation, The Invasion of France, official War Department documentary. It opened with pre-invasion footage, ships assembling in British ports, troops boarding, equipment being loaded. Then the crossing, aerial views of the fleet stretching across the channel. Then the invasion itself, naval bombardment, landing craft approaching through obstacles, troops wading ashore under fire. The footage was extraordinary, but to German prisoners conditioned to dismiss everything as propaganda, it looked like Hollywood fantasy, until they saw something they recognized. The moment of recognition. Wilhelm Schwartz had surrendered on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the invasion. His unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, had defended Omaha Beach and been virtually destroyed in 48 hours. He'd been transported through British captivity to America, arriving at Camp Clinton in August. For weeks, he told his fellow prisoners that Normandy was a temporary setback, that German reinforcements had pushed the Allies back to the sea, that the whole invasion had failed. He believed this because he wanted to believe it, because accepting the alternative, that the invasion had succeeded, that the Allies were advancing, that Germany was losing, was too painful. The camp guards didn't argue with him. They didn't need to. They had film. When the D-Day documentary began, Schwartz joined his comrades in mocking it. The ships were too numerous. The operation too massive. Obviously exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Then came the wide shot of Omaha Beach. Schwartz recognized it immediately. The terrain was burned into his memory. He'd spent 3 months fortifying that sector. He knew every bunker, every obstacle, every contour of the bluff. The camera showed his bunker, W62, Widerstands Nest 62, Resistance Nest 62. He'd been in that exact position when the bombardment started. He'd fired from that exact embrasure at Americans coming ashore. And behind those Americans, filling the sea from the surf line to the horizon, were the ships. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. Destroyers so numerous they overlapped in the frame. Transport ships extending beyond the camera's ability to capture. The largest assembly of naval power ever concentrated in one location. All real. All there. All documented. That's real, Schwartz heard himself say. Then louder, that's real. The laughter stopped as if cut with a knife. Ernst Hoffmann, sitting 3 rows back, stared at Schwartz, then at the screen. You're lying, he said. You're letting them get to you. It's propaganda. I was there. Schwartz shouted. That pillbox in the corner, I served in it. That church, I saw it destroyed. Those ships, his voice caught. Those ships are real. Every one of them. There were so many we couldn't even count them. The bombardment lasted for hours. Hours. Every ship firing. It was like the world ending. The projector continued running. The camera panned across the beachhead. LCTs, landing craft, tank, disgorging Sherman tanks. LSTs, landing ship, tank, with their bow ramps down, trucks driving directly onto the sand. Dukas, amphibious trucks, hauling supplies. Everywhere, vehicles. Everywhere, equipment. One of the German prisoners, a former logistics officer, started counting vessels in the frame. He stopped at 40. And the camera was still panning. Still showing more ships. More landing craft. More steel. That's one beach, someone whispered. They said there were 5 beaches. On screen, the narrator confirmed, Operation Overlord involved landings on 5 beaches across a 50-mile front. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. If this was one beach, and there were 5 beaches, and each had a similar number of ships, the mathematics were crushing. Klaus Brenner, who minutes earlier had been laughing at Hollywood special effects, did the calculation in his head. 5 beaches. Perhaps 500 ships visible in this frame. Times 5, 2,500 ships minimum? The film answered his unspoken question. Text appeared on screen. Operation Overlord employed 6,939 vessels, including 1,213 warships and 4,126 landing craft. The number was incomprehensible. The Kriegsmarine, the entire German Navy, had never fielded more than 400 surface vessels at its peak. The Allies had assembled a fleet nearly 20 times larger for a single operation. Impossible, Brenner muttered. But his voice carried no conviction. The film continued. Footage of Utah Beach, Gold Beach, Juneau Beach, each showing similar scenes, thousands of ships, massive naval bombardment, waves of landing craft, mountains of supplies. Then aerial footage showing all 5 beaches simultaneously. The camera was high enough that the curvature of the coast was visible. And along that entire curve, 50 miles of coastline, ships. An unbroken line of steel stretching from one end of the frame to the other. A prisoner in the middle of the room stood abruptly and walked out. Then another. Then 5 more. The camp guards made no move to stop them. This was part of the process. Some men needed to leave, to process what they'd seen, before they could accept it. But most remained transfixed, unable to look away from the evidence of their defeat. The bombardment footage. The film shifted to footage of the naval bombardment, filmed from both ships and shore. The USS Texas, a battleship, fired its 14-inch guns at German fortifications. The camera captured the muzzle flash, the recoil, the shell's impact on the distant shore. Then the film showed the same bombardment from the receiving end, footage captured by Signal Corps cameramen after the invasion from German positions. The destruction was absolute. Bunkers reduced to rubble. Trenches obliterated. The earth itself reshaped by the violence of hundreds of naval guns firing for hours. Obergefreiter Schwartz stared at footage of his own bunker being destroyed. He'd survived only because he'd retreated inland before the position was completely demolished. Men he'd known, boys, really, teenagers conscripted in the final desperate months, had died in that bunker. And this film showed their deaths as a logistics exercise. A problem solved by the application of sufficient naval gunfire. Impersonal. Industrial. Overwhelming. We never had a chance, Schwartz said quietly. From the moment those ships appeared, we never had a chance. The prisoner next to him, a veteran of the Russian front who'd been captured in Italy, nodded slowly. I've seen the Russians attack with massed artillery. I thought that was the worst bombardment possible. This. He gestured at the screen. This is different. Not just more shells. More systematic. More controlled. They're not just shooting at us. They're erasing us. The film showed post-bombardment aerial reconnaissance. German defensive positions simply gone. Miles of fortifications swept away as if they'd never existed. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted coastal defense system, built over years with slave labor and enormous resources, had been breached in hours. Not through tactical brilliance or superior soldiers. Through the application of overwhelming material superiority. Steel defeating concrete. Industrial production defeating military engineering. But the truly devastating footage came next. The logistics. The film showed the buildup after the initial landings. Day 2. Day 3. Day 7. Day 14. The growth was cancerous. Organic. Unstoppable. On D+1, the beachhead held thousands of vehicles. By D+7, tens of thousands. By D+14, the beaches had become cities made of equipment. Tank parks stretching for miles. Supply dumps the size of German towns. Fuel storage facilities holding millions of gallons. And still the ships came. The film showed them in time-lapse, landing craft approaching the beach in endless succession, disgorging cargo, withdrawing, returning with more. An industrial process. Assembly line warfare. One sequence showed the construction of the Mulberry harbors, artificial ports built by the Allies because no existing French port could handle the volume of supplies needed. The Mulberry harbors were engineering marvels. Massive concrete caissons towed across the channel and sunk to form breakwaters. Floating piers that rose and fell with the tides. Roadways built on floating pontoons. Complete artificial harbors, built in weeks, handling more cargo than most permanent ports. The German prisoners watched in stunned silence as the film showed Liberty ships, mass-produced American cargo vessels, unloading at the Mulberry harbors. One ship every 4 hours. Each carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. Dozens per day. Hundreds per week. A former German logistics officer named Hauptmann Friedrich Weiss stared at the screen and did mathematics that made his stomach turn. If each Liberty ship carried 10,000 tons, and they were unloading perhaps 6 per day, that was 60,000 tons of supplies daily. In 1 month, 1.8 million tons. The entire Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front consumed perhaps 30,000 tons of supplies per day. The Americans were landing twice that much in France. Daily. And this footage was from June, 3 months ago. If they'd sustained this rate, they'd landed perhaps 5.4 million tons of supplies in 3 months. Weiss stood abruptly. "Turn it off," he said in German. The American camp officer didn't understand the words but recognized the tone. "Keep watching," he said through an interpreter. "This is what you were fighting. This is what defeated you." "We know," Weiss shouted. "We know. You don't need to humiliate us further." The officer's voice was not unkind. "This isn't about humiliation. This is about truth. You need to see this. You need to understand." On screen, the film showed aerial footage of the Normandy beachhead 6 weeks after D-Day. The entire coast had become an industrial zone. Temporary harbors. Airfields bulldozed from farmland. Roads constructed in days. Supply networks extending inland like a circulatory system. And still the ships came. Still the supplies flowed. An endless tide of material that no military force could stem because it wasn't really a military operation at all. It was industrial production relocated to a beachhead. When reality becomes undeniable, the final sequences of the film showed the breakout from Normandy in late July. Operation Cobra. American aircraft carpet-bombing German positions. Not dozens of planes. Not hundreds. Thousands. The film showed formation after formation of B-17s and B-24s, each dropping tons of bombs on a 3-mile front. The ground erupted. The camera shook from the concussion even though it was miles away. Entire forests disappeared. The landscape was transformed into a moonscape. Then the tanks came. Hundreds of Shermans, pouring through the gaps in German lines. Not attacking. Not fighting. Simply driving through because there was nothing left to stop them. A prisoner who'd been at Normandy, not in the invasion, but in the fighting afterward, stood and pointed at the screen. "I was there," he said, "at St. Lo, during the bombing." The room turned to him. "I was in a bunker 2 kilometers from the target area. We felt the earth shake. We thought it was an earthquake. When it stopped, we came out." He paused, reliving the memory. There was nothing. Nothing left. Just craters and dust. Men buried alive. Tanks flipped over. The entire regimental command post simply gone. He looked around at his fellow prisoners. "This film, it doesn't show the half of it. We lost 4,000 men in 1 hour. Not killed in combat. Erased. Deleted from existence. And then the Americans just drove through the gap like we'd never been there at all." The film ended with footage of American tanks rolling through French villages to cheering crowds. The date stamp showed August 1944, 2 months ago. The lights came up in the recreation hall. 300 German prisoners sat in silence. No mockery. No laughter. No defiant claims of propaganda. Just silence and the weight of understanding. The camp guards let the prisoners sit for several minutes before dismissing them. Many didn't move. Wilhelm Schwartz sat with his head in his hands. Everything he'd believed for the past 3 months had been a lie he'd told himself. The invasion hadn't failed. Germany wasn't winning. The reports of Allied advances weren't propaganda. It was all real, all true. And Germany was losing, had already lost, to an enemy so vastly superior in industrial capacity that the military outcome had never been in doubt. Ernst Hoffmann approached Schwartz. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I called you a liar. But you were there. You knew." Schwartz looked up. "I knew they landed. I didn't know." He gestured helplessly. "I didn't know it was that big. I saw one beach. From one bunker. In the chaos and smoke and terror, I saw landing craft and ships and I thought, I hoped, it was local. That they'd landed a division or two. That we could contain it." "But you saw the ships," Hoffmann pressed. "I saw ships. Dozens. Maybe 100 in my field of view. But the smoke, the confusion, I told myself it was just my sector. That other sectors would hold. That reinforcements would push them back." He laughed bitterly. There were no other sectors. It was the same everywhere. And there were no reinforcements because everything we had was already there. And it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Over the following days, the film's impact rippled through Camp Clinton. Arguments broke out between prisoners who'd seen the film and those who hadn't. The believers versus the deniers. But increasingly, the believers won because they had evidence. "Go to the recreation hall Tuesday," they'd say. "Watch the film. Then tell me it's propaganda." The camp commandant, Colonel James Patterson, noted the change in his reports to the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. The D-Day documentary has had significant impact on prisoner attitudes. Resistance to re-education efforts has decreased markedly. Prisoners are more willing to engage with educational materials. Many are now asking guards about the progress of the war, which they previously dismissed as propaganda. The film appears to have broken through their conditioning by providing evidence too specific and detailed to dismiss as fabrication. Other camps reported similar results. The D-Day films, and later films showing the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, and eventually the discovery of concentration camps, forced German POWs to confront realities they'd been conditioned to deny. Once the initial breach in their belief system occurred, other truths flooded in. Prisoners who dismissed American productivity claims now reconsidered. If the U.S. could assemble 7,000 ships for one operation, then perhaps the reports of tank production weren't exaggerated either. Perhaps American factories really were producing thousands of aircraft per month. Perhaps the industrial statistics they'd been shown weren't propaganda. Klaus Brenner, who'd mocked the factory footage the previous week, requested permission to watch it again. This time, he didn't laugh. He watched footage of the Willow Run plant in Michigan producing B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 per hour and believed it. Because if America could assemble 7,000 ships, why couldn't it produce 18,000 bombers per year? The mathematics suddenly made sense. Not propaganda math, but actual industrial mathematics. Germany's total production, 1939 to 1945. Aircraft, 120,000, tanks, 50,000, artillery pieces, 175,000. American production, same period. Aircraft, 300,000, tanks, 88,000, artillery pieces, 257,000. And America was also supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies. The prisoners had known these numbers intellectually, they'd been told them in re-education classes. But they dismissed them as impossible exaggerations. Now, having seen 7,000 ships on one beach, the numbers seemed not just possible but conservative. Friedrich Weiss, the logistics officer, spent days doing calculations. By his math, the supplies landed in Normandy in the first 3 months exceeded Germany's entire production capacity for 6 months. "We were fighting an economic entity, not an army," he concluded in a letter to his wife that camp censors intercepted and filed. Germany fielded superior soldiers, superior tanks, superior tactics. But America fielded superior production. And in modern war, production is what matters. We brought skill. They brought abundance. Abundance won. Liberation footage. In November 1944, Camp Clinton showed another film, footage of the liberation of Paris. The prisoners expected propaganda about French gratitude and American heroism. What they saw was something different. The film showed American columns entering Paris on August 25, 1944. But the most striking footage wasn't combat, it was logistics. The camera showed supply trucks rolling through Paris in an unbroken stream for 18 hours. Not combat vehicles. Not tanks. Just trucks. Thousands of trucks. Deuce-and-a-halfs, 2.5-ton trucks, carrying ammunition, fuel, food, equipment. The narrator explained, the U.S. Third Army advanced 400 miles in 2 weeks. This required 400,000 gallons of fuel daily, delivered by the Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks in continuous operation. Wilhelm Schwartz, watching this new film, understood something he hadn't before. The ships at Normandy weren't the impressive part. The ships were just delivery vehicles. The impressive part was that America's industrial base could keep filling those ships, could produce 400,000 gallons of fuel daily for one army, and that was just one of several allied armies in Europe, could manufacture 6,000 trucks for a supply operation, and those were just the trucks for one supply route, could sustain this level of material support indefinitely because American production exceeded consumption. The gap didn't narrow over time, it widened. Germany's strategy had been to win quickly before Allied industrial superiority could manifest. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was born from economic necessity as much as tactical innovation. The strategy had failed in Russia. It had failed in Africa. And it had catastrophically failed in France. Now Germany was fighting a long war, a production war, against an enemy that outproduced it in every category. The film showed French civilians cheering American soldiers. But Schwartz barely noticed them. He was watching the trucks. Still coming. Still flowing. An endless river of logistics. That's why we lost, he said to no one in particular. Not because we couldn't fight. Because we couldn't supply. The film program at POW camps wasn't just about showing defeat. It was about showing an alternative. After the military footage came films about American democracy, civil society, and economic systems. Films showing town hall meetings where citizens debated policy, elections where government leaders were chosen by vote, free press where newspapers criticized the government, labor unions negotiating with employers, diverse communities living together. For prisoners conditioned to believe democracy was weak and chaotic, these films were revelatory. Democracy didn't make America weak. It made America strong enough to outproduce every dictatorship combined. Capitalism didn't create inequality and suffering. It created an economy that could assemble 7,000 ships while simultaneously maintaining the highest standard of living in the world. Individual freedom didn't cause social chaos. It unleashed innovation and productivity that centralized planning couldn't match. The evidence was undeniable because the prisoners had seen the results. The ships, the supplies, the industrial output. Post-war surveys of repatriated German POWs showed 68% had more favorable views of democracy after captivity, 71% believed American economic system was more effective than they'd been told, 54% said film evidence was crucial to changing their views, 61% said they would support democratic government in post-war Germany. Many former POWs became leaders in post-war West Germany, bringing with them lessons learned in American camps. The Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle, was built partly on American aid, but also on the understanding that free markets and democracy produced prosperity that centralized control could not. The seeds were planted in POW camp recreation halls, watching newsreels they'd initially mocked. Conclusion. On September 12, 1944, 300 German prisoners entered a recreation hall expecting to mock another propaganda film. They left in silence, having confronted the undeniable evidence of their defeat. The laughter had died when Wilhelm Schwartz recognized his bunker on screen. When the impossible fleet proved real. When the mathematics of industrial production became too overwhelming to dismiss. That moment, when mockery turned to silence, was replicated in hundreds of POW camps across America. Tens of thousands of German soldiers experienced the same progression. Denial, rationalization, acceptance, transformation. They'd been told they were fighting for a superior civilization against decadent democracies. The films showed them the truth. The decadent democracies had outproduced, outfought, and outlasted the thousand-year Reich. They'd been told American industry was collapsing, American society was fragmenting, American military was incompetent. The films showed 7,000 ships assembled for one operation. Mountains of supplies landed on French beaches. An industrial base that produced material abundance Germany couldn't approach. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. But for many, it was also liberating. If the lies about American weakness were false, perhaps the other lies were false too. Perhaps the master race theory was wrong. Perhaps democracy wasn't weak. Perhaps Germany's path had been mistaken from the beginning. The films didn't just show military defeat. They showed an alternative vision, a society where democracy, capitalism, and individual freedom produced prosperity and power. That vision, planted in POW camps through newsreels and documentaries, would help build the foundation for post-war Germany. The recreation hall at Camp Clinton went dark. The projector shut down. The prisoners filed out in silence. But in that silence, transformation had begun. The mockery had ended. The truth had started. And 7,000 ships sailed across the screen into history, carrying with them the death of Nazi illusions and the birth of a new understanding. The propaganda had been real all along. And reality was more overwhelming than any propaganda could be.